So, what is perception? We define perception as the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting sensations into a meaningful and coherent picture of the world. So, how we see the world around us. One thing to remember about perception is that not everyone perceives things the same way. So, two people may be exposed to the same stimuli or sensations, but recognize, organize, and interpret them differently based on their own needs, values, and expectations. So, for example, if we're walking down the street and I see a sign that says shoes $10 or less, that's really not going to get me going. But I have a friend who would insist that we stop the car. No joke. I mean, she sent me an article the other day telling me that Payless is coming back, and she's so excited. So, yeah, different people see things differently. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. Or different people perceive things differently, I should say. One big issue with perception is that it's hard to figure out what is real. Um, you know this already, dealing with people, trying to figure out who's telling you the truth and who's an authentic person, so on and so forth. When we look into marketing, though, it's hard to know what's real because we have all of this marketing and issues with things like Photoshop. So, for example, the woman on the left at the bottom is Madonna, and this is Madonna on the right after Photoshop. Similarly, the woman on the left is a bikini model, I believe, and you can see her skin similar to Madonna, looks very different in the photo on the right after she's been photoshopped. One thing that I always like to say about Photoshop, though, is as a person who's taken some short classes, a few days, twice I think, and who uses Photoshop semi regularly, a couple times a year at least, and who has Photoshop downloaded on her computer, I find Photoshop to be kind of weird to use and sometimes a little difficult. But I mean, I just love the fact that there are everyday people who are willing to go out and use Photoshop to make themselves look better and learn the tools to do so. That just shows you that anyone can learn anything. So, how do we perceive things? One commonly held view is what we call realism. We see the world as it is. We register sensory inputs and report them back. Another view that is deemed more accurate by most policymakers, lawyers, uh, marketers, academics, so on and so forth, is called naive realism. We believe we see the world as it is, but remember that perception is an active and somewhat constructive process. So we use prior information as well as our expectations, our goals and desires, so on and so forth, when interpreting incoming information. A great example of this would be the political arena, right? So if you watch a political debate, whether it's the Democratic debates or whether it's kind of the more advanced debates, with the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee, how we perceive the debate and how we perceive what each person is saying often depends on the information that we already know and believe about those people. Something like a bombshell would have to go out for us to not support the candidate we went in supporting, right? So if you are a Trump supporter, for example, what Trump says, you probably will believe and support after a debate featuring Trump. On the other hand, if you are a supporter of Democrats, you will likely do the same for the Democratic nominee. And politicians use this information. They know this, right? And so one thing that happens in a lot of debates particularly when we get down to the Republican versus Democratic nominee, is that they're not really saying anything, right? So you have a moderator who's asking questions, but when you actually sit down to look at the answers that are being given, there are no real answers being given, right? They kind of talk around the questions and pivot a lot and do things like this. And so you don't walk away with a real sense of any kind of answers. So it's kind of interesting. A few slides ago, I think on the first slide, I talked about this idea that perception is important to marketers, and it is. It tends to be vital, and it really affects the success or failure of products in the marketplace, right? So, for example, how do you perceive Ford versus how do you perceive Toyota? Um, when I was growing up, Ford was an acronym, and people would say, found on roadside dead, but people believe that Toyota, lasts forever. Toyota products last forever. And now, living in Detroit, you don't see such a negative perception of Ford, right? People like Ford products, people buy Ford products. And so, is there a discrepancy between perceptions of Ford and Toyota? Absolutely. The question becomes what underlie those perceptions. One might be location. Detroit has Ford is headquartered in Detroit, and so perceptions are different. On the other hand, people might know someone who's had a Toyota for 30 years, and so their perception is different. In order to understand, though, how perception affects the marketplace, we need to understand some basic concepts that underlie the perceptual process. So we'll talk about those in a few slides, or we'll begin to talk about those in a few slides. I'll have a think break on the next slide, something for you to think about. So it's hard to talk about sensory marketing without talking about these thresholds that exist. So oftentimes we look at Weber's law or Weber's law, different people pronounce it differently, which just says the amount of change that is necessary to be noticed is systematically related to the intensity of the original stimulus. The stronger the initial stimulus, the greater a change must be for it to be noticed, which makes a lot of sense. And I think this is a great example. If you make $10 an hour, you might need, let's say, 50 cents to notice the difference, an additional 50 cents per hour to notice the difference in terms of a raise. However, if you make $20 an hour, right, this is a stronger initial stimulus, you're going to need more money in order for you to really notice the difference. So if you make $20 an hour in this instance, you might need to receive a dollar extra an hour to actually notice the difference. This is why a lot of people don't notice differences when it comes to, paltry raises. So if you're in a situation where you don't get a raise or they give you a 1% raise, it's just not as noticeable because 1% is just not a lot comparatively for most people. We'll spend the next few slides talking about thresholds. And so we'll first start with the idea of absolute threshold. So the absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulation that can be detected on a given sensory channel. So, for example, on a billboard, what's the minimum amount of stimulation that can be detected by consumers, right? So is the billboard size big enough? Are the colors bold enough? So on and so forth. Over time, the absolute threshold tends to get smaller and smaller as consumers get used to a stimulus, right? So we start to adapt to we tend to engage in sensory adaptation, so we start to adapt to this our senses start to adapt. This would be the reason why people will start off using a smaller amount of a new fragrance, and then after a while they'll use more and more because they can't smell it as strongly because their nose gets used to the scent, so they must use more. Just like consumers and their noses, marketers need to increase or change sensory inputs in order to keep the attention of their target market. So Just like a consumer needs to increase the amount of perfume they use, we as marketers must increase either a promotion for people to notice a promotion, or we increase the size of the billboard, so on and so forth, so people can continue to notice the promotions or sales tactics or advertisements that we're using. So I'll give you an example of absolute threshold. A few years ago, the NBA decided to allow a change in jerseys. Does anyone know? Do you know off the top of your head what the change was? For those of you who don't, the NBA started allowing companies to put their logos on, or yeah, their logos on jerseys. And so you can see uh, for the Boston Celtics, GE started putting their logo on their jerseys. For the Kings, Blue Diamond Almond started putting their logo on jerseys. For the Utah Jazz, the company that owns Qualtrics paid to have the Utah Jazz put not their logo, not Qualtrics' logo on there, but the logo of a charity that the owner also supports, which I think is like Five for Fighting or something like this. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a charity. I think it might be cancer, but again, I can't remember off the top of my head. The question, though, now becomes, and I think this was one of the reasons they wouldn't do it to begin with, and they finally relented and allowed it for advertising and money making purposes, is if the logos start off small, as you can see they are small here, eventually consumers are going to tune it out. Companies are going to be less invested in paying for, you know, this space, this premium space on jerseys, and so are companies going to want bigger and bigger logos on the jerseys for their money's worth. And it makes sense that they would, but then it becomes, you know, one of those things where it's like, oh, you're selling out the brand, you're selling out the you know, the sports company, so on and so forth. And I think this will cause a lot of issues down the road. So differential threshold, another type of threshold, is how much stronger one stimulus needs to be relative to another, so someone can notice that the two are not the same. So how different does, let's say, the Pepsi logos you see on your right, or my right, need to be for people to notice that they're different? So can the average consumer tell a difference between Pepsi's logo in 1898 versus the Pepsi logo in 1905, the Pepsi logo in 1998 versus 2003 versus today, for example? And so we're constantly trying to figure out this differential threshold. Weber's law states that the greater the initial stimulus, the greater the additional stimulus needs to be in order to be noticeable, right? So if you have this really noticeable initial stimulus, then you have to just really up your game a lot more for the next stimulus or additional stimulus to be noticed. So, for example, we could look at Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker here, I mean, is just kind of interesting. So Betty Crocker has definitely evolved. Um, One thing about Betty Crocker, though, I hope you notice, is that Betty Crocker actually doesn't look that different. In my opinion, she doesn't. I don't think she's that. I don't know. I mean, you'll have to think about. I don't know. Uh, I don't think she looks that different. One thing that does look different are Betty's. I hope we're on a first name basis, Betty. Betty's clothes. Um, so she goes from wearing, this red and white on the very end at the top left to wearing a full red suit with white pearls, and the third picture to wearing a white shirt with a red, it looks like a red sweater pulled over. I don't know. I would argue that this is not that great in terms of kind of changing the stimulus. But what I will say, and what I think where Betty Crocker is going really well, or doing really well here, is that the initial stimulus isn't that great, right? So the change doesn't have to be that great for people to notice a difference, right? So again, when we talk about this differential threshold, because the initial stimulus isn't, that impactful, um, any new changes also don't have to be that impactful. And so I guess they're winning, I guess is what we could say here. I'm not sure if I said this in the slide or two ahead when I talked about Weber's law. Another way, or another way to discuss Weber's law, or another name for Weber's law, is actually just noticeable difference, or JND. So keep that in mind for the exam. I usually like to say JND as opposed to Weber's law, or just noticeable difference as opposed to Weber's law, just so you know, and you can, be ready for that on the exam. So applications of Weber's law, or J&D, to marketing. One, it affects price changes. It applies to price changes. So to be effective, price discounts have to exceed the just noticeable difference, meaning that if you want people to notice a price discount, you have to make it large enough that people can notice it, right? So, if the price of cereal was $3.48, and you give people a 2 cents discount and you make it, $3.46, this doesn't exceed the just noticeable difference. That's barely noticeable, right? So no one's going to pay attention to that. On the other hand, if you knock off 15 cents, maybe people would notice it a little bit more. This is why companies tend to use percentages as opposed to amounts. By the way, on the flip side of that, price increases should be below the just noticeable difference. So you want people to see price increases as not being that big, right? So you want it to be lower than the just noticeable difference, right? So in addition to that, negative changes, whether it's reduction in product size, or as again, or quality, or as I said a second ago, increases in price, need to be not noticeable. Changes in product or package size, companies often use a strategy of downsizing to combat the price increase, or I'm sorry, to combat rising cost of ingredients. This is a smart strategy, but again, you want to make sure that this isn't noticeable, right? You want to make sure that people don't notice this kind of a thing, that they don't notice that the package size is dwindling. In each of the last three lectures, I've talked about pricing at some point, because pricing strategies are so important to marketers, because it's so important to consumers, right? Price is an information cue that is perceived and interpreted by consumers, right? How you price an item means something to people. If you set a high price, consumers are going to assume that it means high quality. If you set a low price, consumers are going to usually assume the opposite, right? You have to also think of things like your reference price, which is the price against which buyers compare the actual selling price, right? So if you have an item on your shelf and you've priced it at, let's say, $33.99, and you said this isn't a sale, well, if a person who shops at your store every single week comes in and they notice that this says $33.99 on sale, but every time they've looked at it for the last few weeks, it said $33.99 is its normal price. No one is going to think that that's a sale, right? They've seen that price and now you see a sale sticker on it, but the price itself hasn't changed. There's going to be a problem because the reference price is $33.99 for that consumer, and your sales price tag means nothing. At the exact same time, we have to remember that consumers are really good about comparing the original price to the sales price, right? So if you say something is on sale for $33.99, but the regular price was $34, most people aren't going to actually consider that a sale, minus a penny. What is that, right? And frankly, sometimes, some sales prices just are too low. If you're giving a 3% discount, it's just, for a lot of people, just not good enough. So something to keep in mind. So it's hard to talk about it's hard to talk about stimuli changing and whether or not the consumer notices without talking about shrinkflation. So shrinkflation is a title given to shrinking products, right? So over time, companies will often shrink the size of products, and they say things like, "We're shrinking the size of products to keep up with the fact that the cost of inputs continue to rise," right? And we don't want to raise our prices, although I'm not sure I actually believe that because a lot of companies will raise their prices and go ahead and shrink the product too, right? And we've seen instances where products get smaller because raw materials cost more, but when raw materials start costing less, you don't see those products go back to the regular size. I mean, they're This is kind of a cool example from Plasman et al. In 2008. They looked at people's expectations of wine when they know the price of said wine. And what they found quite clearly is that when people were told that the wine is more expensive, they liked it more. So wine one was like significantly more when they were told it was $45 and $5. Wine two significantly more when when consumers were told that it was $90 versus $10. And then wine three, they just said was, $35, and you see how much people liked it. And even though people seem to like wine three, you can still notice the pattern that they don't like it as much as they like wine one at $45 or wine two at $90. So our prior expectations, i.e., we assume that more expensive wine will taste better, will affect kind of our perceptions of said wine, of said objects, in this case wine. So needs also shape our perception, and this is kind of an interesting study that's pretty famous. So what the authors did, and this was 1947, by the way, what the authors did is that they took a group of rich 10-year-olds and a group of poor 10-year-olds, and they showed them coins, so from a penny up to a $50. And they wanted to see how the rich children and the poor children perceived the coins. Stick with me to the next slide. So what they found essentially is that poor children overestimated the coin size significantly more than rich children, right? And they did this according to Bruner and Goodman, and this has been kind of replicated, and people buy into this idea. They did this because they have bigger needs, right? So a half dollar is needed more by poor children, so they overestimate the size more. Quarter is needed more, for a poor kid than a rich kid, and again, so they overestimated and made it more. What's kind of interesting though is that when the coins were present, the students or the kids overestimated the size more, but when the coins were absent, the poor students overestimated the size more. But when the coins were absent, poorer students demonstrate less susceptibility to this phenomena. So when the coins are absent, they don't really see as big of a gap between the size of a penny and the size of a half dollar. It's only when the coins are actually present that the poor students say, hey, a half dollar is significantly bigger than a penny. So kind of interesting. Again, needs can shape your perception. You have more needs for money, you may be more likely to overestimate the size of said money. Goals can also shape our perception. So there was a poll that was ran in by Gallup in 2012, and it said, regardless of which candidate you happen to support, who do you think did the better job in last night's debate, Mitt Romney or Barack Obama? Republicans overwhelmingly chose Mitt Romney, i.e., their candidate. Uh, Democrats were a little bit more studious, right? So a little bit, I would say maybe a little bit more kind of what do I want to say? They had a little bit more discretion, and so they chose Romney, but in a smaller proportion. So Democrats 49 to 39 said that Romney did better. Independents less than Republicans, but also said that Romney did better. The biggest takeaway, though, is that usually, when you favor a candidate, you might perceive that they did a better job, and this is a great example. 97% of Republicans believe that Romney did a better job, and I'm sure that when the debates start happening this year, we'll see something very similar where 90 some odd percent of Republicans will say Trump did better, and then you'll see the split with the Democrats, so on and so forth. So every now and then you see these stories that, if you play a video backwards, you can hear, the devil's music, or if you look into a poster, you can see, some advertising for, it's always something religious when when it makes the news, I guess is what I'll say. And the people who bring these issues up will argue that this is subliminal perception. Subliminal perception occurs when the stimulus is below the level of the consumer's awareness, and that's why I mentioned earlier when Ashton Kutcher was saying something like this is subliminal advertising. It's not really subliminal advertising. If I see Ashton Kutcher with an Audi, or I see him with Evian water, I'm very aware of what I'm seeing, and obviously. Most of us can put two and two together, and realize that there's some level of advertising going on there. That said, not that said, in the past, certain advertisers have been accused of using subliminal advertising, um, and it can be effective. Research shows that people are stimulated below their level of conscious awareness, so you can be affected by things that you aren't consciously aware of. And so it's a really interesting topic. The thing that we need to realize for this class, though, is that it is illegal. So subliminal advertising is illegal, and companies that do it will get in a lot of trouble, usually fines. So that brings us to the topic of perceptual selectivity Each day we are surrounded by stimuli, whether it's, I'm sitting in my living room right now, so whether it's my television or the chairs around me, whatever, we're surrounded by all kinds of things. And we are able to subconsciously exercise selectivity over what we actually perceive or what stimuli we pay attention to. So you might not pay attention to billboards on the highway, or this might be something you absolutely pay attention to or see out of the corner of your eye. Or if you're like me and you're walking down the street, you pay attention to almost nothing because I don't know, I'm just kind of focused, I guess. So, when we talk about perceptual selectivity, how do we decide subconsciously what we're going to pay attention to? Um, it depends on three factors. One, the nature of the stimulus. So, it's physical attributes, package design, brand name, so on and so forth. Our expectations. So, based on familiarity or past experience or expectations of what we should expect to see and what we should expect to kind of be exposed to. And then our motives. So, whether or not we have needs or wants for a particular object or service offering or anything, right? So, I mentioned before in another lecture that I love funnel cakes, so I'm always on the lookout for like a festival that might have one. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm joking. But one thing that I do pay attention to is sometimes when I'm walking, I'll pay attention to women's outfits, not necessarily to emulate the outfit, but to emulate the color pattern that they choose. I've noticed that a lot of people are a little bit more off the range in terms of putting funky colors together, and I tend to be kind of boring. And so I try to pay attention to that just in case, something kind of strikes my eye and I can try to emulate that. Little tidbit about myself. Along the lines of perceptual selectivity, there is also perceptual defense. Consumers subconsciously screen out stimuli that they find psychologically threatening, even though exposure has already taken place. So we can see something and then subconsciously try to uh, tune it out, right? Try to ignore it, so on and so forth. So we use perceptual defense, for example, for ads with intense fear appeals. If you go to European countries, if you go to Australia, for a while at least, they had these images on tobacco packages that were really psychologically threatening if you were a smoker, right? And even if you weren't, you're thinking, "Ooh, this is kind of gross." Research has shown over and over again that people will try to tune this out. Smokers have a reason to tune this out. They don't want to um, think about the dangers of smoking, especially if they're going to continue to smoke. If you're a non-smoker, you also try to tune this out because you don't smoke and you think because you don't smoke, you don't have to worry about these type of things. Um, Although to be fair, a lot of us have vices, and those vices have kind of it could have their own fear appeals if the government so chose. And so we also try to tune things like this out because it scares us, even though we don't smoke. Another term to be aware of, perceptual blocking. Consumers protect themselves from being bombarded with stimuli by tuning out or blocking such stimuli from conscious awareness. The difference between perceptual blocking and perceptual defense. Perceptual defense comes after seeing the stimuli takes place. Perceptual blocking attempts to avoid the stimuli altogether. So maybe you're walking through Times Square, and as you know, if you've been to New York, Times Square, you're bombarded with a lot of advertisements on buildings, on the streets, so on and so forth. Maybe what you decide to do is keep looking straight so that you don't see all the billboards on buildings. Or maybe you're keeping straight because you don't want to run into all of the people who are actors trying to get you to take pictures with them to pay them. You might use perceptual blocking if you're walking down a street with a lot of people who are doing something like asking for money if are one of the people who don't give money to people who ask for money. Anyway, that's perceptual blocking, and that's the difference between perceptual blocking and perceptual defense. Perceptual distortions also affect perception. So, perceptual distortions are incorrect understandings or abnormal interpretations of a perceptual experience. I am going to actually show a video in class. I put the video in the slides here, similar to the product placement video. You'll see a link in the slide just in case you want to watch the video on your own. Other influences of perceptual distortion, there are two effects that are relevant here. The first is called the halo effect. The other is called the horns effect. I'm going to describe them, and then I'm actually going to let you watch a short video that gives examples of them. So the halo effect occurs when an individual generalizes about a variety of attributes based on knowledge of one attribute of an individual or product or service. What does this mean? It's when it's essentially when you take one positive characteristic about a person, a brand, or a service, and you then assume that because of that one, that one positive characteristic means that the product, the service, or the person is totally good, right? So, an example, and again, I'm going to let the video explain it, even though the video is only 1 minute. It is pretty thorough. So, an example would be Subway. So, Subway, the sandwich company, has one positive characteristic. Their food is fresh, right? That's a positive characteristic. And we could argue that it's fresher than, let's say, something like McDonald's or Burger King or somewhere like that. And so some people, and Subway has actually kind of promoted this, but some people will say, their food is fresh. That's one positive characteristic. And they'll assume that that means that their food is positive, right? So, for example, their food is fresh, positive characteristic, so their food must be healthy. Their food is fresh, so their food must be good, right? So they take one positive characteristic and they extrapolate that to mean that the entire product is good, or the entire person or service is good. The horns effect is the opposite. So you take one negative characteristic and you assume that because of that one negative characteristic, the whole thing, whether it's a product, a service, or an individual, is bad. So, this food is frozen, so this food must not be healthy, or this food is frozen, so this food is bad, right? This food is frozen, so it, doesn't taste good. Something like that. And that also is doesn't really happen either, but that's just a perceptual distortion. Again, if I highly recommend that you watch the video here for other examples. Plus, it's a really cute video. There are some influences of perceptual distortion. One, physical appearances. There's a reason they place what are considered beautiful models in advertising, because they know that beautiful models tend to be very persuasive. People tend to say, hey, this product is associated with someone beautiful. It must be good, right? I must buy it, so on and so forth. Stereotypes also are big distortion factors. So we tend to have kind of these existing views of various kinds of stimuli, and we use these stereotypes to help us anticipate certain situations, people, or events, so on and so forth. It also influences how products are perceived, right? I have a stereotype against mint flavored stuff because I just always think it tastes like toothpaste. And so if you came up with a new product and you told me it was mint flavored, I will probably pass on it. Sorry. Another kind of factor when it comes to perceptual distortion would be first impressions. Our first impressions tend to be crucial for brands and people, frankly. They tend to be long lasting. It's hard to recover from a bad first impression, and it can be fatal for a brand. So when you're rolling out new products, when you're rolling out new brands, when you're rolling out new people, it doesn't matter what it is. You want to make sure that the first impression is the best impression because people often remember that. And then last but not least, we tend to jump to conclusions, and this can distort information, right? We might not listen to all the information being presented before making a conclusion. I know I've talked about politics, but I have to mention this. I can't remember who it was. It had to be Romney or Barack Obama. Maybe it was Bill Clinton. I don't remember. Anyway, there was this political debate, and whoever the speaker was kept blinking, right? And so people spent a lot more time talking about the blinking than they did the actual debate performance. And a lot of people didn't listen to the information being kind of, you know, given to them by the debater because they were so focused on the blinking, right? Um, we often do that. We often jump to these conclusions. We don't make kind of informed decisions. You might do it with, your favorite person. So your favorite person in the world tells you that X is a good thing. You like them, so you say X is a good thing too, even though X is a terrible thing. Anyway, so jumping to conclusions can kind of influence our perception and lead to perceptual distortion.